Before the money, our life was a finely woven tapestry of small, beautiful things. I remember the exact texture of it. It was the feeling of my wife's hand in mine as we walked through the grocery store, a calculator app open on my phone, meticulously following the budget we'd set on Sunday night. It was the shared, triumphant smile when we realized we had enough left over for a bottle of cheap wine. Our wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the trust it took to navigate a world of tight margins together. We were a team. Our two-bedroom apartment with its slightly crooked kitchen cabinets and a faucet that dripped in a rhythm only we understood was our fortress. Our dreams were modest and therefore attainable. We talked about saving up for a trip to the coast, maybe next year if my freelance work picked up. We celebrated paying off a credit card with the same joy some people reserve for a new car. Love in those days was a quiet, practical thing. It was me fixing the squeaky floorboard under her side of the bed. It was her leaving a sandwich for me in the fridge when I had to work late. We didn't have much, but we had this unshakable belief that we were building something solid together, a life whose value was in its shared construction, not its final, polished appearance. The phone call that tore it all down came on a Tuesday. It was a lawyer from a state I'd never been to, with a voice as dry as old paper. He informed me that my great-uncle, a man I'd met only once as a child and remembered only as a cloud of cigar smoke and a scratchy wool sweater, had passed away. And then he said the words that detonated our reality. He named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. I expected a few $1,000s, maybe an old car. I was not prepared for the number the lawyer recited, a string of digits so long it sounded like a phone number. It was a fortune so vast, so utterly disconnected from our reality that my first reaction was to laugh, assuming it was an elaborate prank. But it was real. In the span of a single phone call, we were transformed. The initial shock was like a lightning strike, leaving us dazed and buzzing. Then came a wave of hysterical, unadulterated joy. We danced around our small living room, laughing until we cried, the sheer absurdity of it all overwhelming us. Every single financial worry we had ever had, every late-night argument about a car repair or a dental bill was not just solved, but annihilated. We felt like we had been given a cheat code for life. The first thing we did was quit our jobs. We walked out of our old lives with a giddy, cinematic flourish. Then we paid off everything. The mortgage on our apartment, the loan on our 10-year-old car, the last few stubborn credit card balances. With a few clicks of a mouse, we erased years of careful, painstaking struggle. The feeling was not just relief, it was a form of power, intoxicating and immediate. The tapestry of our old life was unraveled thread by thread. Our meticulous budget, the document that had governed our shared existence, became a joke. Price tags became irrelevant suggestions. For the first time, the answer to "can we afford it?" was always, without exception, yes. The first big purchase was a car, a sleek black German sedan that looked alien and vaguely predatory parked in our humble apartment complex lot. Then came the clothes. We walked into stores we used to walk past with a sense of detached longing and bought whatever we wanted. My wife, who had always been so creative with her thrift store finds, was suddenly draped in designer labels. I saw a flicker of someone I didn't recognize in her eyes as she looked at herself in the mirror, a harder, more appraising glint. The small, happy routines that had been the bedrock of our marriage began to crumble. A quiet night in with a rented movie was no longer enough. Why stay in when we could go to the most expensive restaurant in the city? The joy of cooking a meal together was replaced by the impersonal perfection of a private chef. The change was subtle at first, a slow poisoning of the well. Our conversations, once filled with shared jokes and plans for our modest future, now revolved around things. What to buy next? Where to go next? The teamwork that had defined us vanished because there was nothing left to team up against. We had won the game and we didn't know what to do next. New friends began to materialize, drawn to the gravitational pull of our new wealth like moths to a flame. They were people who had never noticed us before, people who talked about their portfolios and their summer homes in the Hamptons. They laughed a little too loudly at my jokes and complimented my wife with a sincerity that felt manufactured. I watched her blossom in their attention, becoming more confident, more polished, and more of a stranger to me with each passing day. One evening, I suggested we go for a walk to our old favorite pizza place, a small, unassuming spot with checkered tablecloths. She looked at me, a faint line of confusion on her brow, and said, "Why would we do that? We can have anything we want delivered." In that moment, standing in the cavernous, professionally decorated living room of the new house we had just bought, a house 4 times the size of our old apartment, I felt a profound and terrifying sense of loss. We were surrounded by unimaginable luxury, and yet all I could think about was the simple, shared joy of a $10 pizza that now felt more valuable and more unattainable than our entire bank account. The weight of the money was a physical presence. It was a constant, low-level hum in the back of my mind, a responsibility I was completely unprepared for. I couldn't just let it sit in a bank account. That felt like a dereliction of duty. I had to become the kind of man who belonged to this new fortune. I had to be an investor. It became an obsession. I consumed books on the stock market, I watched financial news channels with a religious fervor, and I threw myself into a world of acronyms and abstractions that I fundamentally did not understand. The idea of slow, steady growth through safe investments like bonds or index funds felt boring, almost cowardly. That was for old money, for people who had the luxury of time. I had come into this wealth suddenly, and I felt a frantic pressure to grow it just as quickly, to prove that I was not just a lucky idiot who had stumbled into a windfall, but a shrewd captain of capital. This led me to a man I'll call a financial advisor, though in truth he was a predator in a bespoke suit. He smelled my insecurity and inexperience from a mile away. He didn't talk to me about risk management or diversification. He spoke to me about once-in-a-generation opportunities and disruptive technologies. He made me feel like I was being led into an exclusive club. He painted a picture of a future where my passive income would be so vast, my wealth so dynamic, that the initial inheritance would look like seed money. I was completely seduced. I funneled millions into high-risk tech startups with slick presentations and no actual products, into volatile cryptocurrencies I couldn't explain to my own wife, and into speculative stocks that promised exponential returns. Each transaction gave me a gambler's high, a feeling of control and power that was an addictive antidote to my profound sense of being an imposter. While I was building this phantom empire of risk, my wife was constructing a physical one. We had bought a house, but it wasn't a home. It was a statement, a sprawling, minimalist mansion with more bathrooms than people and vast, empty rooms that echoed with our loneliness. She threw herself into decorating it with a desperate, frantic energy. Art dealers, interior designers, and landscape architects became our new family. Our life became a performance piece. She started hosting lavish dinner parties for our new, wealthy friends. I would stand in a corner of my own house, a glass of obscenely expensive wine in my hand, listening to my wife talk about art auctions and charity galas with a fluency that was both impressive and alienating. She was playing a role, and she was playing it brilliantly. But when the guests left, the silence that descended was crushing. We had nothing to say to each other. We were two actors who had forgotten their lines. The money had become a wall between us. Our arguments started as small skirmishes and escalated into full-blown wars. I would accuse her of being wasteful, of treating our fortune like an infinite resource. I'd point to the bills for a single party that were more than our old monthly mortgage. She would fire back that I was miserly and controlling, that I was hoarding the money and forgetting how to live. She accused me of being obsessed with my investments, staring at my phone all day like a zombie, my mood tethered to the meaningless green and red lines on a screen. We were both right. The money had warped us into caricatures, the reckless gambler and the frivolous socialite. It had become our entire identity, and we used it to bludgeon each other in every fight. The first real blow came from a biotech startup I had poured an obscene amount of money into. They were supposedly on the verge of a revolutionary breakthrough. The advisor had called it a sure thing. Then came the news that their clinical trials had failed spectacularly. The stock plummeted to zero in a single afternoon. Just like that, a sum of money that could have sustained our old, happy life for 100 years was gone. I didn't tell her. The shame was too great. I couldn't admit that my grand strategy was a failure, that I was nothing more than a fool with a large checkbook. So I started lying. I created a separate set of accounts, a shadow financial life where I could hide my losses and try to win it all back. I started making even riskier, more desperate bets, convinced that I could fix the hole in our fortune before she ever found out. I was no longer an investor. I was an addict, chasing the next high, the next win that would make everything right again. I was alone in my giant, beautiful house, staring at screens that reflected my own mounting panic, while my wife was out somewhere living a life I was funding but was no longer a part of. The foundation of our marriage, once built on the solid ground of shared truth and trust, was now riddled with the sinkholes of my secrets and her resentments. The collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. The market, which had been the source of my arrogant confidence, turned on me with a brutal, indifferent savagery. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. The speculative tech stocks that had promised to change the world began their long, inexorable slide into oblivion. The cryptocurrencies I had bragged about at dinner parties lost 90% of their value. Every green shoot in my portfolio withered and died. The confident, reassuring voice of my advisor was suddenly impossible to reach. My calls went to voicemail, my emails went unanswered. The man who had led me to the promised land had vanished at the first sign of the apocalypse. I was alone with my collapsing empire. The numbers on my screen were no longer an abstract measure of wealth. They were a direct assault on my identity, my intelligence, my very sense of self-worth. I was in a constant state of low-grade panic, a cold sweat on my skin that never seemed to dry. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, and grab my phone, praying for a miracle in the overseas markets, only to be greeted by another sea of red. I tried to maintain the facade of control. I still put on the expensive suits and went to the meaningless social events with my wife. I would smile, shake hands, and talk about the market with a confidence I didn't feel, my voice sounding like a stranger's in my own ears. But the performance was becoming impossible to sustain. The stress was eating me alive. I was jumpy, irritable, and emotionally absent. My wife noticed, but she interpreted my distance as disinterest, my anxiety as a judgment on her spending. The wall between us grew higher, thicker, and colder with each passing day. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet, mundane arrival of the mail. I had become careless, so consumed by the financial fires I was fighting that I forgot to cover my tracks. She found a statement from a brokerage account I had hidden from her. It wasn't the main account, but it was one I had used for some of my most reckless, leveraged trades. It showed not just the catastrophic losses, but the enormous debt I had incurred trying to chase them. She confronted me in the kitchen, that vast, marble-clad monument to our new life. She didn't scream. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, as she held the piece of paper in her hand as if it were a piece of evidence at a murder trial. I had no defense. The lies, the half-truths, the carefully constructed deceptions all fell away, leaving me exposed and pathetic. I tried to explain, to rationalize, but the words sounded hollow even to me. The fight that followed was the final, devastating earthquake that brought the whole rotten structure down. It was about more than just the money I had lost. It was about the trust I had betrayed. She looked at me with a contempt that was so pure it was almost beautiful. She saw me for what I was, not a master of the universe, but a scared little boy who had been given a toy too big for him to play with and had broken it. And in her anger, she revealed her own truths. She told me how much she hated this life, how she hated the fake friends, the empty house, the constant pressure to be someone she wasn't. She confessed that she had only found solace in the spending, in the material things, because it was the only part of our new life she could control. And then the final, fatal blow. She told me about the other man. He was one of our new friends, a man whose family had possessed wealth for generations. He was everything I was pretending to be, confident, secure, and at ease with his fortune. While I had been losing our money, he had been offering her comfort and understanding. He represented stability in the world of chaos I had created. She said she was leaving me. The words were delivered with a surgical precision, devoid of any emotion. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for reconciliation. She had already made her decision, her exit strategy planned while I was busy planning my doomed investment strategies. She left that afternoon. Her expensive car, filled with her expensive clothes, crunched down the gravel of our long driveway and disappeared. I was left standing in the doorway of a house I now hated, a house that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum for a dead marriage. The inheritance had promised us everything, a life without limits. But it had only shown us the profound and painful limits of who we really were. I had lost the money, but that was nothing. The real loss was the quiet, simple love we had shared in a small apartment, a love that was now just a distant, painful memory. It was the only thing of real value we had ever possessed, and we had let it burn. The silence in the aftermath was the loudest sound I had ever heard. In a house designed for cocktail parties and echoing laughter, the stillness was a physical weight. I wandered through the empty rooms, touching the expensive furniture and art that my wife had chosen, and felt nothing but a profound sense of alienation. These were not my things. This was not my life. This was the stage set for a play that had closed on opening night. The process of dismantling that life was a brutal but necessary surgery. I called a realtor and put the mansion on the market. I sold the cars, the watches, the wine collection, everything. Each sale was a painful admission of failure, but also a small step back toward reality. I watched as the symbols of my fleeting wealth were hauled away, leaving me with nothing but the stark, unforgiving numbers on a page. After paying the debts from my leveraged trades and the settlement from the divorce, the vast fortune had shrunk to a modest, almost laughable sum. It was more than I had started with, but it was a pittance compared to the peak. It was the wreckage, the debris left over after the storm. I moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was clean, simple, and blessedly anonymous. The day I moved in with only a few boxes of books and old clothes, I sat on the floor and cried. Not with sadness for what I had lost, but with a strange, overwhelming sense of relief. The pressure was gone. The crushing weight of having to be someone I wasn't had been lifted. I was no longer a high-flying investor or the owner of a mansion. I was just a man in an empty room, and for the first time in years that felt like enough. I needed a job. I needed a routine. I went back to something I had loved before my life was hijacked by money, working with wood. I got a job in a small, local cabinet-making shop. The owner, a grizzled man with sawdust in his eyebrows, didn't care about my past. He only cared if my joints were tight and my cuts were straight. The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. The smell of freshly cut maple and the hum of the planer became my therapy. I was creating tangible, useful things with my hands. It was the complete opposite of the abstract, digital world where I had lost my fortune. I was building again, but this time it was something real. I created a budget. The irony was not lost on me. I sat at my small kitchen table with a pen and a notebook, just as my wife and I used to do, and I planned out my modest income. This budget wasn't about limitation, it was about freedom. It was about knowing where I stood. It was about rebuilding a life on a foundation of reality, not fantasy. I reconnected with the friends I had neglected, the ones from my before life. I was terrified of their judgment, but all I found was a quiet, unassuming acceptance. We met for cheap beers and talked about our lives, our jobs, our relationships. They didn't care that I had been a millionaire, and they didn't care that I had lost it all. They just cared that I was there. I realized that true wealth is not about having a large bank account. It's about having people in your life who will show up for you when that bank account is empty. I think about my ex-wife sometimes, not with the bitterness I once felt, but with a kind of weary sadness. The money didn't turn us into different people. It just amplified who we already were. It preyed on my insecurity and her dissatisfaction. It was a catalyst that accelerated our self-destruction. I heard she married the other man. I hope she's happy. I genuinely do. Last weekend, I finished building a small bookshelf for myself out of reclaimed oak. As I ran my hand over the smooth, finished wood, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that was 1,000 times more real than any stock market gain. My life is small now. It is quiet. It is measured not in dollars, but in the satisfaction of a day's work, the comfort of old friendships, and the peace of knowing exactly who I am. The inheritance gave me a spectacular view from the top of a mountain, but it was a cold and lonely place. I'm much happier now, walking on the solid ground of a simple, ordinary life. Thanks for listening to this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how global our community is. Comment your country down below. Share this story to your friends and leave a like and subscribe for more episodes like this.